This video was developed with help from the Resources for Inclusive Education in Evolution workgroup. For more information and their other available educational tools, check the link in the description. Acclimation is a type of phenotypic change which occurs in response to an environmental cue. But after the cue is removed, the phenotype can revert to its original state. A nice example for acclimation is the change in aerobic capacity, measured as the maximal oxygen consumption during intense physical exercise. To measure maximal oxygen consumption, athletes are made to perform intense physical effort, such as running on a high-speed treadmill or cycling. The oxygen and carbon dioxide intake and output is measured. As the intensity of the physical effort increases, so does the oxygen demand in their body. However, this increase is not linear, and it reaches a plateau at a certain point. This plateau corresponds to the maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max. VO2 max is a value that depends on several factors that can be categorized as supply or demand. Supply is the transport of oxygen from the lungs to the mitochondria, while demand is the rate at which the mitochondria can reduce oxygen. The oxygen demand is dependent on the mitochondrial activity. Limiting factors for oxygen supply combine pulmonary function, cardiac output, blood volume, capillary density of the skeletal muscle, but also oxygen pressure in the air. At this stage, pause and think about these two questions. Is VO2 max genetic? And can it change in an individual, and how? So VO2 max has a genetic component to it because lung capacity, the development of the heart muscle, capillary density are all heritable traits. Similarly for blood carrying capacity, which can be determined by the amount and shape of blood cells. In people with sickle cell anemia, which is a hereditary genetic disorder, blood carrying capacity for oxygen is severely decreased because of the misshaped red blood cells. However, we can also increase our lung capacity and the strength of the heart muscle, even the capillary network in the muscles, with lifestyle modifications. Typically, exercise will boost all of these values, whereas smoking will decrease them. Moreover, changing the atmospheric pressure of oxygen will change the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs and the blood, which can also reflect in the VO2 max value. A recent study was examining the effect of high altitude on VO2 max in 8 elite athletes. To do this, the athletes underwent VO2 measurements with a twist. They were running in a hypobaric chamber, which allows to control the oxygen pressure in the air. Lower oxygen pressure corresponds to higher altitudes. The test was performed multiple times at different oxygen pressures. This graph represents the results of the experiment for each athlete. The x-axis shows the barometric pressure, which corresponds to specific altitudes. The y-axis corresponds to VO2 max measured at each of the altitudes. Carefully study the plot and think about the following questions. Regarding the first question, how does VO2 max change with altitude? If we look at the general trend for all athletes, we see that the maximal oxygen consumption decreases as altitude increases. This indicates the existence of phenotypic plasticity for VO2 max at different altitudes. The plastic response is due to the decrease of atmospheric pressure, which results in decrease of the partial oxygen pressure, which enables oxygen supply from the lung to the bloodstream. You can also see that the maximal oxygen consumption is not the same for all athletes. Despite the generally decreasing trends with altitude, some athletes have higher and some lower maximal oxygen consumption. This indicates genetic differentiation for VO2 max among athletes. Lastly, changes in maximal oxygen consumption observed at a certain altitude do not persist. This type of phenotypic plasticity that transiently changes the phenotype of an individual is called acclimation. Interestingly, acclimation to high altitudes is often used to boost competitive athletes' performance so that they would be more performant at lower altitudes. In conclusion, VO2 max has a genetic component demonstrated with the different values measured in different athletes, which likely have innate differences in lung and heart capacity, blood volume, or capillary density. VO2 max is also a plastic trait because it varies in response to environmental changes, such as changes in the air pressure which modifies the oxygen supply. Lastly, these changes are not permanent, and therefore after returning to lower altitudes with higher atmospheric pressure, VO2 max should return to its original value in each individual. This type of reversible plastic response is called acclimation.